Everybody, welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, January 26th of 2022. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. We've got a fun stream on tap for us today. We've got some interesting questions in the queue, a few questions about, we'll start with some single entry questions, a couple questions that I think are mostly more about variance and diversity in our DFS lineups, but some kind of open-ended questions there on the NBA side. Always some questions about late swap here. Love the late swap questions, so we'll talk a little bit more about late swap strategies, some questions about research builds, and a few other things here in the queue. So looking like another pretty busy stream for us here today. If you missed it, yesterday we had an awesome 2-hour long stream yesterday. So loved that. Love getting all the questions from you guys. Love seeing this stream continue to grow. So we'll go ahead and just jump right in. But before we get started, before we jump all the way in here, as always, especially if this is your first time watching the stream, this is open Q&A. We do the show live for a reason. So if you've got questions for me here, pop them into YouTube chat or pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we will answer questions in about the order that they come in here. So let's go ahead. Let's get into it. First off, I discovered today, I think this is new maybe on my streaming software, or I just didn't notice it before, but I got this different view here where I can stick me down in the corner like that instead, which means that the actual SaberSim screen is basically full screen for you guys, except for this part that obviously is going to be blocked out in the corner. But I don't think that's a super important part of the screen for most of what we end up talking about here. I think it kind of pops up the message below that. Anyway, I don't know. This is what we normally do. We normally have me, wait, not that. We normally have me off to the side here like this. So let me know maybe in the chat which one you guys like better. Here's option 1, right? And here's how it'll look when there's a question up on screen. And then option 2 is me over here on the side. And here's how it looks when a question is up on screen. So let me know option 1 or option 2, right? I'm going to leave it the way we've had it, but this is the first time I've noticed that. And I figure maybe it's a little bit easier to read the screen. I don't know. I know some people have mentioned that at times it's hard to read what's happening on screen. So anyway, we'll let that go. We'll leave it the way it is today, but let me know in the comments or let me know in chat what you guys like more there. And let's get into some questions here. So bit of a interesting question came in through support here overnight last night. So excited to talk about this one a little bit. A couple of different ways to take this down, and we'll talk about everything here. So let's go ahead. Let's get into it. This is from Terrence. And he said, what is the best way to take down single entry games? I'm usually around top 10, but I can't seem to beat out guys like McLovin, Oxen Duck, and other guys like that. They always seem to have that one player that accrues points that I don't have or wasn't on my radar. Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen this question before, why can't I beat these guys, these pros, these sharps, guys I see at the top of all my contests all the time. I'm going to say this. First of all, the DFS pros that are out there, these sharp guys, right, they're generally very good at DFS. They are hard to beat. They're a sharp competition. And I think, honestly, one of the better things that I would recommend here is changing the way that you're thinking about this, of like, how am I gonna beat these guys at the top? If you have access to contests that are under $3 on DraftKings or FanDuel, play those. Play the contests where the sharpest players cannot even enter until you no longer have access to those contests. You're giving up a free edge choosing to play against sharper competition. Especially, based on the way this question is written here, it sounds like maybe what's getting played is like smaller field, medium to high stakes single entry, right? Just based on the fact that this question says I'm usually around top 10, right? If you're regularly top 10, even in a single entry contest, it probably sounds to me like it's a bit of a smaller field. Those are going to be very tough contests, right? If you're playing a 500 person, 300 person single entry GPP night to night on a FanDuel contest, how many NBA DFS pros or extremely skilled NBA DFS players do you think are out there on a given night playing this contest? It's probably a lot. They're taking up a lot of equity in this contest, especially if you're finishing top 10 regularly in these. You're probably already a pretty sound player. You're just setting yourself up to fail by playing the toughest contest to beat, which are these small field, medium to higher stakes single entry contests. So here's what I would recommend as a starting point is I'm not going to, since we have a lot of questions in the queue here for today, I'm not going to do a full breakdown on our contest selection principles, but I would go and watch this video, The Fastest Way to Crush NBA DFS in 2021, which is a breakdown of both the DraftKings and the FanDuel lobby in order of, for NBA, in order of what contests I think are the softest, what contests are the best ones to play first. And the short answer is recommending playing contests that are under $3, playing as many entries at low stakes before moving up in stakes, and playing contests with a high number of effective entrants, which is the total number of lineups divided by the number, the entry limit per person, in order to get your lineups into the softest contest possible. Now, if you do all of that, and you also start playing multi-entry, right, that's going to be a kind of a far cry away from maybe what you're used to if you're used to being kind of more of a single lineup guy, right, playing just a single lineup every single night. This is quite a bit different, right, because you may be all of a sudden playing 20, 40, 60, even more lineups a night, right? Can be a big difference. So I don't want to necessarily just say, stop playing medium to high stakes single entry and focus on some of the lower stakes MME, even though I think that is good advice. So the second part of the way that I'll answer this question is going to be, how do I think you can use, how do I think SaberSim can best be used to build single entry lineups, right? And it's not going to be that different than the typical process, but let's talk about this a little bit. I think one of the things that I noticed from people that are kind of self-described single entry players is that there is a little bit too much of a reliance on hand building. And I get it. When you're hand building a lineup, you feel you have like the ultimate amount of control over the way the lineup comes together. But I think just with the way human bias can get in the way, it's very easy to build a lineup and without realizing it, have a lineup that is far over leveraged for that size of contest, or far under projected, or vice versa, far too chalky even for the lineup. And I think SaberSim can be very helpful here as a tool to transition the way you're thinking about your single entry lineups from hand building to hand picking, right? You will still have the opportunity to leave your mark on the lineup, but you can allow SaberSim to fill in the gaps of what remains, the other components of the lineups, and make sure that you're playing a lineup that has equity, that is well built for the contest you're playing. So how this would look in practice, this is basically the number one way that I recommend using SaberSim to build single entry lineups if you are primarily just a one lineup player. And that is to come in here, right? Probably first off to leave most of step one alone, to go to your build settings, specify your single entry contest, which in this case, I'm going to assume it is, I wanted to make sure this wasn't FanDuel or DraftKings specific. So doesn't really matter site to site, but let's just assume it's kind of a small field, right? And we'll set your build settings to what we think is appropriate for the contest you're playing. So in this case, a little bit of correlation, not much ownership fade, a little bit of variance for a relatively small field contest. And let it build 500 lineups for you or so. And we'll say, let's look at the top 10. And we'll build this. And what this is going to do is it's going to build a pool of 500 different viable lineups that SaberSim thinks makes sense for this particular contest, right? I mean, to put that in perspective, right? We're building 500 lineups in just a couple seconds for a 500 person contest, right? In many ways, this is kind of basically saying like this is the full spread of viable lineups based on where the projections are right now. From here, let's make a couple minor updates to projections just so we can see the lineups. This is where we basically have, so we have 500 lineups in our pool, and we need to ultimately end up with one. And I think there's a couple ways to do that. One of my favorite ways to do that is to just close this whole exposure thing and not really worry about exposures, and instead go into your pool and look at all your lineups and kind of eyeball this here and go lineup by lineup, looking for lineups that you think you kind of like and checking them into the pool and using kind of a bit of a process of elimination here. The other thing I like to do is if you've already built a portion of a lineup for yourself, right? Let's go ahead and pull this back up. You can start locking certain players into this lineup and building around it and seeing what are viable options around it, right? Maybe you are all in on playing Giannis tonight, right? If you're getting 5%, ownership on Giannis, you want to take a shot playing that, and maybe that's like your one stand, right? What this is going to do is when we lock this in, it's going to bring up our favorite Giannis lineup, right? And we could even say, here are maybe 5, right? And maybe you've got another core play here. Maybe you want to, let's see. Maybe you've decided that you want to run this back with somebody on Cleveland here as well. These aren't players that are very well projected here. So maybe this isn't a good example. Let's pick somebody that I know that's not going to kick this right back at me. Let's say you want to take a shot and play more of a stars and studs kind of build and see what single entry options are available where you play Harden and Jokic together, right? Let's see. Do we have any of those? We have one, right? So maybe this is our lineup. Maybe it's not, right? Maybe we want to do Harden and Jokic here. And let's do something here where we try to do some random guy. Okay, so in this case, we set my locks for my single entry lineup. The guys I've already decided I want to play Harden and Jokic together. I want to play them against each other. And I also like playing Precious Achiuwa for one reason or another, right? Then what you get here is you get this message down here that says we need to build the lineup pool in order to match exposures. And you get the opportunity to use this as a bit of a flag, right? What the builder's actually saying to you is that this combination of players is not in the first 500 viable single entry lineups for your 500 lineup contest you are playing, right? It is probably not true. Now, the projections could be off. The ownership could be off. There could be issues with the model. There could be reasons that it's still profitable to play these 2-3 players together. But the builder is indicating to you that this really isn't a viable lineup. And you get an opportunity to check yourself and kind of say, okay, does this make sense, right? Is this an appropriate way to play this slate, or should I adjust the way I'm thinking about this and come back and maybe select different players? And if you're hand building or even just kind of looking at projections and then kind of hand building, whatever, you don't ever get that opportunity to check that assumption, right? Or check where that is coming from. We may have built a lineup in that particular case that was far under projected or far over leveraged compared to what it needed for this particular contest. So I would say if you are, hold on, my cord is all wrapped up here. It's bothering me. If you are playing single entry contests, right, and you want to play single entry contests, and you're building just a single lineup or just a couple lineups for the slate that night, this is the way I would recommend doing it. That said, if you are frustrated that in your $20 400-person single entry, you are frequently seeing some sharp name at the top of that contest, I would say go play contests where the impact of those sharpest players are going to be lower or where they can't play at all. And I think you will probably find that you have much better results there. So good question, Terrence. We'll get you a recording to this answer here on this stream. And if you have any follow-up questions here for me, let me know if you have any or if this was helpful. But let's go ahead and keep this going here. I do see a quick question from T. He said, how do I see the time of the latest update on mobile? I tried putting my mobile browser in desktop mode and I still don't see last updated. I can only see the time on the computer. Thanks. Yeah, this is just an oversight on our end. The mobile site doesn't have the timestamp. Unfortunately, I think I will make sure that we've got that noted down to just put that back in. I think this was just a miss here when we released our redesign. I think the easiest thing to do if you're on a phone, just get Slack on your phone and just follow the NBA lineup alerts channel in Slack. That's going to be more descriptive, more helpful anyway in terms of telling you what sims have run, what teams games have run, what has updated, what news has come out. I think that's probably the easiest way to get around that. So okay, cool. Let's keep it going with other questions here. Okay, so a couple questions here that I think are actually, even though they're written a little differently, I think they're kind of similar flavors here. But we're going to start. This one is from JSJR3. And I think it's an interesting question, but the question just says, what are some good strategies to use to make major jumps in your GPP contests? I think there's a lot of different ways to interpret what this question is actually asking. But I think because in some ways this question might just be what are some ways to perform better in GPPs, and we've got a whole YouTube channel full of content about that. But I think kind of the way that I interpreted this question when I first read it is, what are some ways to kind of significantly differentiate your lineups, right? Or create lineups that have a much higher range of outcomes, much more upside in them, right? And I think the easiest way to do that, or one way that I think is maybe a good answer to this particular question is to crank up your variance slider a little bit, right? And this is actually, I think, going to be a similar answer to the next question. But when we're talking about making major jumps, right? If you want to have a big spread of different outcomes in your lineups at the end of the night, which is probably a good thing, right? The easiest way to do that, or one way to accomplish doing that, is going to be increasing your variance slider, right? What this is going to do is it is going to limit the range of outcomes of each set of simulations that are used in each. Actually, it's going to make smaller the bucket of simulations used to build each individual lineup, which basically widens the impact of the full range of outcomes of each player. So when you get that Giannis 80-point sim in your bucket that's used to build that lineup, that individual sim has a much greater impact on the lineup at 8, 9, or 10 sim variance than it does at 1, 2, or 3 sim variance. So when your sim variance is lower down here, right, you're going to get lineups that are all much closer together because they're all built with a much more similar set of projections, which are all close to the average. When your sim variance is up here, you're going to have a much wider spread of lineups, right? You are theoretically going to give yourself more opportunities to have lineups at the very high end of the upside, right? Kind of curve or where the contest graph is, but you're also going to have lineups that have a much lower outcome comparatively, right? Because your range of outcomes is literally much wider on a per lineup basis. So if you are interested, again, I think there's a lot of ways to interpret this question. I'm kind of just picking one way, but if you are interested in having bigger gaps between your performance of each individual lineup you are playing, you want to spread out the outcomes of your lineups that you're playing in a contest, I think one way you can do that is increasing your sim variance slider a little bit. But that is going to mean that your ultimate floor of each individual lineup is lower, right? You can't increase the upside of a lineup in general without also trading off some of its floor, because that's the way it works, right? Outcomes get wider on both ends. So again, let me know if there was, I think there's some room to interpret this. If there was another way you were trying to ask this question or something I wasn't totally understanding here, let me know. But cool. And then I wanted to jump. This is another interesting question here. Like I think kind of similar, or at least the way I was thinking about this was somewhat similar. This one's from Toyo Driver. And he said, could you please discuss ways to approach and adjust for NBA slates like we had last night, where there's a tremendous amount of value? It's Riv at 380 doesn't cash. It looks like I just didn't end up with a lot of diversity built around the value. So this is an interesting point here, right? And I think rather than actually thinking about this so much from a process standpoint, I think the biggest adjustment that you have to make on a slate that does have a lot of value is more from a mental standpoint, or more from an expectation standpoint, right? On a slate where there is tremendous value, right? So tonight we have, I would say at this particular point in the day, we have what I would describe decent value, probably maybe on the poorer value side overall for a 10-game slate. We have a couple 7x projected plays, a couple 6x, couple 5x plays, right? Decent value. Last night going into the slate, we had multiple players close to 10x, 9x, 8x plays, right? Basically the entirety of New Orleans and Toronto were all value plays. Now, those value plays are not secrets. Those are highly projected owned plays that most of the industry is going to be on because they project very well no matter what model you are looking at. So when you are setting expectations for yourself for that slate, I think there are two things you should just be aware of. One is that scores are going to be a lot higher, right? Ultimately, the score that your own individual lineup scores without the context of whatever any other lineup in your contest did is basically meaningless. Saying a lineup scored 380 or 475 or 325 ultimately means literally nothing. It says nothing about the performance of the lineup. The performance of lineups can only be compared to other lineups in the particular contest. So as you are preparing for a slate that has a lot of value, I do think it can be somewhat important, even if just as a way to avoid tilting the slate, to remember that scores are going to be higher in that slate than you are probably accustomed to because the projections are higher. It's easier to get higher projected lineups, right? But secondarily to that, and I think this is maybe the more practical side of this question, is the other thing you should set as a mental expectation for yourself is on a slate where there is a lot of value, where there are very highly projected plays, that your lineups are likely to condense a little bit more in terms of their lineup construction than they would on other slates, right? Even with the same sim variance settings. Because what's ultimately going to happen if we look at yesterday's slate, right? Let's pull yesterday's slate back up just so we can talk about this a little bit. right? Okay, so no 9x actually, no 9x or 10x, but I mean a ton of very highly projected plays overall for the slate, right? What's going to happen is when you are building these lineups for this particular slate and you're using sim variants to bucket your sims for each individual lineup, right? Because some of these players are projected so highly on average, even when you get their 40th percentile sims or their 30th percentile sims, or in a given lineup, a set of outcomes that is closer to their floor, a lot of times that floor is still so high that they end up going in the lineup anyway, right? The difference between rostering Nickeil Alexander-Walker at a 31.37 projection at 37K, right, or 3.7K salary, versus using the replacement player at a similar position and price is massive. So even when he doesn't have a spectacular outcome, you're still going to get him, right? And what that means is that your lineups are all probably going to condense because the best plays on the slate are extremely viable in a significant portion of their range of outcomes. So even when you widen the range of outcomes for each player, you're still getting them in your individual lineups. All of this is to say, I promise you I'm wrapping around to the point here, your lineups are going to be more condensed, even at the same sim variance setting on a slate that has a lot of value options than on a slate that doesn't. So in terms of it making an adjustment there, and mostly just because this question specifically says it looked like I didn't end up with a lot of diversity built around the value, right? That is a natural effect of the value that's available on the slate. Right? If you have a ton of under 4K value at a specific set of positions, you are going to end up building lineups that use those players and roster pay up options at the other positions in the lineup that are available, right? If all the value is at point guard and there's spectacular value at point guard, then your pay up options are naturally going to be expensive forwards and centers. So, does this mean anything? Is there anything that we need to do on this? Well, it ultimately depends on your personal strategy, right? Your personal risk tolerance. How comfortable are you being condensed on a slate? I think last night, at least in my initial build of 20 or so lineups, I think I had 100% exposure to almost 4 different players, right? I think it was 100% exposure to 4 different players. That's something that typically doesn't happen very often to me, but last night it did because of the way that the value projected, because of the way that the slate broke down. So my results, my inter-lineup results last night were very correlated, and my performance ended up not being very good across the board, and all of my lineups were kind of close together. Now, if you said you're not comfortable even on a slate with spectacular value available, you're not comfortable all of your lineups going down with the core ship that you've kind of have together, then what I would recommend is cranking up the variance slider even more, right? And basically tell the builder, like, look at even a thinner range of outcomes for each player, and look at even a smaller set of simulations for each player to force additional diversity into these lineups so that I am not playing unnecessarily, or I'm not playing too risky for me. I don't want to say unnecessarily risky. I'm not playing too risky for me, right, on this particular contest. And some of this is not going to be like a do this step 1, step 2, step 3, follow these instructions, right? A lot of this is probably going to be running your test build at the start of the slate and looking at it and thinking, oh, wow, the builder's having me have 100% exposure to 4 different players in 20 lineups. What's going on with those players? Oh, wow, there are 4 players projected over 8x their salary at their average projection on DraftKings tonight. This is a slate with a tremendous amount of value. I don't want to be that exposed even to the best plays on the slate. And then how do you respond to that? I think one way is to crank up your sim variance slider a little bit more to get some more natural diversity in the build. I think another answer would be to drop some of your exposure to some of those players in step 3. But that would only be if your response to those exposures in your initial test build was that this is too condensed for you. For me, it wasn't. For some players, they want to be that condensed every single night. It's more of a question of personal risk tolerance than actual strategy here. So anyway, I think in general, when you're approaching these slates with a ton of value on NBA, it's less about, the strategic answer, right? The how do we do this from a strategic standpoint? How do we build lineups with higher expected value? I think SaberSim simplifies a lot of that for you, right? Because of the way that we're bucketing sims and then incorporating ownership into your process, right? SaberSim is essentially essentially handling some of that for you, right? It's saying that even at the high ownership, right? That these value plays are still good plays. And the best lineups you can play, even in your large field GPPs, are still built with this similar core that many other people are playing, right? That's at least the approach given to you by SaberSim. I think the answer, the more practical answer here is, what is your individual risk tolerance on these kinds of slates? And what are your expectations of what your lineups are going to look like? So let me know if that helps. Again, I kind of like, the short answer for me is that I don't do a lot of adjustment to strategy on a slate where there's a lot of value. Personally, it's not something that really comes up for me. But I do have kind of that mental adjustment of, scores are going to be high tonight. I'm expecting that. I'm not going to tilt my. I think I had a DraftKings lineup that like scored close to almost 400 points and like probably wasn't even notable in terms of ROI. But you could see the writing on the wall before the slate with that. So, all right. I missed this question from Jolly. I think this was what we were talking about at the start of the stream. He said, "Can this be beneficial if you just play 1 to 3 lineups?" Referring to the strategies that I was talking about at the start here, where you run your build and kind of either hand pick through or set a core after the build. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the better strategies overall in terms of using SaberSim for people playing 1 to 3 lineups. So, if you mean more broadly speaking about SaberSim in general, right? Can this be beneficial if you just play 1 to 3 lineups? Absolutely, right? The advantage that SaberSim gives you in terms of having these game simulations, play-by-play game simulations to leverage when you're building your lineups is valuable whether you're playing 1 lineup or 500. So, all right, cool. Bryant asked a good question here about late swap, and said, "I noticed when I late swap, the minimum salary is set at 49,000. Is it best to keep it 49,000 in case low price value is available instead of making the optimizer force a minimum of 49.5, which is what I normally do?" I think that's more of a slate dependent thing than it is a late swap specific thing, but I could be wrong. I would be cautious cranking up your min salary too far beyond whatever it's set for the default when late swapping specifically. I would say you could even justify dropping it down a little bit lower, mostly just because there are situations when you are late swapping where min salary can get in the way, especially if there's a limited amount. Later in a slate, there's going to be a limited amount of players available to put into the lineups. Each individual lineup that you are swapping probably has less flexibility than it did at lock because there's players that are already in, that are locked, whose games have started. Min salary is just kind of another restriction put on the builder at that point that can cause some problems, right? Sometimes the only swappable player won't allow you to meet a minimum salary at 49.5. So again, I feel like the default on late swap is the same as it is for normal builds. I could be wrong about that, but I probably would not increase it because I think it's just going to put some unnecessary strain on the builder in terms of what is available left on the slate. Also a lot of times when you're late swapping, especially if there's big news that has come up, you are swapping into plays for whom the salary on those players is inefficient. But once you're at that point in the slate and 5 of your 8 players in your lineup have already locked and you have 3 players remaining, the raw salary of the players really kind of stops mattering at all. Over 50% of your lineup, or the majority of your lineup, is already locked in anyway at that point. Right? Those players are already scoring. Their salaries don't matter at all. So you're really just looking of what are the best 3 players that I can put in this lineup, period, under the max salary cap. Not so concerned with trying to build a profitable lineup by using as much salary as possible. You're just trying to put the best possible plays in the lineup. So I don't even think min salary matters a ton at that particular point. I think it probably more just gets in the way of anything. So, but good question. And again, I could be wrong there. Maybe we do. It's possible that for builder flexibility, we do drop down that min salary a little bit on the late swap tool. But I'll check on that. That is a good question. And then Jen, Gen, asked a question about late swap as well. Is there a way to add players to your pool during the late swap process? So good question. I mean, the adding players to your pool, right? You theoretically only need to add players to your pool if you had previously removed them, right? So, there would only be a process of going through and saying, oh, I want to add Jokic and Harden to my pool when late swapping, if at some point earlier in the slate or before lock you had removed them from your pool. And the process of literally adding them back to your pool is just adding them back, right? Clicking them back in. Now, in terms of if adding them to your player pool, interpreted as getting them actually in your lineups, I think the easiest way to force exposure to a player in your lineup when you are late swapping is to either crank their projection or to set a minimum exposure, right? And you can do that here in the entries editor too. So I think I have a couple entries reserved. I'm probably not going to be able to play tonight here, but I have a couple entries reserved, I think, in the quarter that we can use as a demo here. Yeah, so let's go ahead. Let's get these entries in. Let's see here. Okay, 20. Let's get these in here. Fill. Download. Okay. So let's say you're late swapping now, right? And some news has broken. And so you go into swap and you run your swap. And this is actually, I think, probably the easiest way to do it is you go in, let's run our swap. And let's say this is actually for a 20 max, right? And you can kind of run a late swap test build, assuming you have time to do this, but you can kind of run a late swap test build the same way that you run a pre-lock test build, right? And see, how are things looking, right? What has changed? And from here, I think you can kind of validate, am I seeing players in here that I expected to see? Am I getting exposure to certain players that I want? And maybe you late swap and I don't know, maybe there was some minor news with Denver. Somebody on Denver was out and you wanted to make sure that you were getting a certain amount of Jokic and you run your late swap test build here and you're not getting any Jokic in your lineups, right? So again, Jokic is in your pool here. Like the strict definition of pool. He is available to be used in your lineups, but you are not getting any of him. How do I get more Jokic? I think at that point, you can handle this by either bumping his projection or setting a minimum exposure, right? So we go over here, no Jokic, right? Or both. Maybe we say we want 20% Jokic, and we're also going to bump his projection a bit to make him competitive on a point per dollar basis with other players around here. So now let's swap and go from here. And we should get some exposure to him here now, at least 20%. So we have 30%. We bumped his projection, we set a minimum exposure, and now we're all set. So looks good there. So again, strictly speaking here, adding a player back to your pool isn't something that you need. Adding a player to your pool when late swapping is not something you need to do unless you earlier removed that player from your pool, right? And if that's the case, then you can just remove them in by checking them back in here in step one. But if you're not getting a player that you wanted in your late swaps, probably the easiest thing to do is to bump their projection and set a minimum exposure in the entry editor, and then you should get them. So. And then another question here about research builds. Let's talk about this one here real quick. So after looking at the 0010 research build, what indicates a player is a strong player versus a player to fade? So let's hop over to NFL, because I think one thing that I've done a poor job of here on this stream is I don't use these research builds very much in NBA. I don't. I know I use NBA to demonstrate what research builds are, but I think I have been confusing people by using the research build on NBA on stream when it's not actually part of my process. And I don't do them on NBA too much. I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. The reason I don't do it on NBA very often is because your research build really just shows you of how things are looking at a snapshot at that point in time. And because in the NBA, news breaks often, and it is extremely impactful when it breaks, that you could do your research build, you could put in all this time to research, and then 20 minutes or 5 minutes or an hour later, depending on when you do it, all of that work means nothing. And in NFL or baseball, while there is sometimes breaking news, it doesn't happen as often, and it is not as completely disruptive as it is in NBA, right? If there's a starting running back in the NFL that gets scratched, that's extremely impactful, right? But if there is a different catcher in a baseball lineup, that doesn't matter as much. Or if the fourth string wide receiver is on the inactives for an NFL team, that doesn't matter as much. So I do this more for NFL. So let's talk about what this actually is. We have some projections for the weekend slate here for NFL. So the research build that I typically run is a 0-0-10 build, right? So I'm going to get this started here and we'll explain what this does. So sim variance at 10 with correlation and ownership fade at 0 is basically for each individual lineup going to pick out a random single game simulation for both games on the slate, in this case, only 2 games on the slate, and build the best optimal lineup around that set of sims. Then it's going to move on and do that for the second lineup, then the third lineup, then the fourth lineup, and so on. And we are essentially going to simulate the slate 1,500 times and give us the optimal lineup that we can find. I think this is probably stuck, which is unfortunate, but that's okay. Let's give this another shot. Let's put this to 1,500. We are essentially, I don't know why that's not working. We're essentially simulating the slate 1,500 times, right? Now, it's not every single simulation of the slate that we have. It's not every single possible outcome, but it's a relatively large number of simulations, and we can see how often do certain players show up in the optimal lineup. So the most useful thing that I actually get out of this is that I will use this to determine players that I want to be a little bit over the field on, or a little bit under the field on, or potentially just completely fade on either side, right? And I'm basically comparing that player's chance of being optimal or chance of being in the optimal lineup to their projected ownership, right? So let's look at this here and see what we get. This will be fun because I haven't done any research for this week's NFL slate yet. So, okay. So once you have this up, most important thing here is to make sure that you have this you're showing every single simulation, right? And let's drop the projection of a couple players slightly so that we can actually see the lineups. Not that the lineups matter too much, but okay. So the most important thing, the most interesting thing that I think I look at here is the leverage column. And when we're doing it for this particular build, we're actually looking at the leverage, right, of how often is a certain player showing up in the optimal lineup versus the ownership projection. And this can be a way of kind of determining what maybe some plays are, right? In this case, a certain play, because maybe a player is projected to show up in the optimal more than their ownership projection, right? Or a fade, right? In certain cases here, maybe a player that is projected to be rostered much more than the rate that they show up in the overall optimal lineup. And I know, so in my original video where I brought this up, which is my NFL process video here, I know I mentioned leverages of over 10% or over 5%. And I think those have gotten a little bit blown out of proportion in terms of how often I see those brought up. Those are kind of just benchmarks here. I guess let me put it this way. There isn't like a hard and fast rule where every single time I see a certain player add a certain leverage or negative leverage in my research build that I do a certain thing. This is all kind of up to what kind of feels right for me on that particular slate. And it really depends. Like, first of all, I don't trust defenses too much in either direction, right? In fact, I think it's strange that we're getting, okay, so first of all, we are getting 0% Bengals defense here because they're under 3 points. So they are under the player filter. So actually what probably should happen here is I probably should go back and remove the player filter and rerun this again, because this 3-point player filter is getting in the way of this particular build. But regardless, I don't actually look at defenses very much for research builds. I think they're far too variant to do anything meaningful with. I don't think you get a lot of meaningful information out of a research build, but for defenses. But for other players in here, I would start to get an idea of maybe some players that I kind of want to be under on compared to the field, right? And I think this is generally most interesting on the players where there is some disagreement, right? Like, for example, we could say on a 2-game slate, it's not as good of an example, but okay, hang on. Let me think about this here. So sometimes what you will see, especially on an NFL main slate, is that the biggest stands, right? The biggest leverage stands are a player that's barely showing up in the optimal lineup anyway, right? You may have a player that's projected to be like 15% owned, and your most negative leverage stand is you're getting 0% of that player in the research build. That player is showing up in the optimal lineup so little that they're not even likely to show up in your lineups at all, right? And the opposite can be true as well, right? Maybe your highest positive leverage player might end up being, this is a decent example, right? Sony Michel, in this case, projected 1% owned, only showing up in the optimal lineup 7% of the time. Yes, he's probably a positive leverage player, positive EV player to use in the lineups, but he's not going to be showing up in a lot of your lineups organically, very easily, right? So I guess all of this is to say is I think the most interesting players to get out of your research build are typically players that are difficult decisions to make, right? They're going to be very chalky, generally well-projected players that are going to show up in a lot of your lineups probably organically, and maybe you are making a decision to be under on because of the way that the research build came out, right? Like the builder clearly is going to want to use Eli Mitchell and Tyreek Hill and Jamar Chase in this weekend slate, right? But the research build is showing us that they may actually end up being over-owned a little bit compared to how often they show up in the optimal lineup, right? So if we actually, let's just so we can compare, right? Let's just run a test build, or let's run like a test build now here and see what we're kind of getting out of this. And take a look, right? Because what's ultimately happening here when you're going to build your actual lineups, right, is the ownership fade slider comes on and SaberSim starts kind of having its own decisions about this, right? It makes a decision on each individual player. Does it make sense to roster this player given their projection? And I was clearly completely wrong about Sony Michel, a player that right now, given that leverage and given how low his ownership is, the builder actually seems to love, which I think is interesting. But let's look at some of these higher owned players, right? So you can see the builder now is kind of like dealing with some of these same questions, right? Jamar Chase, who was a player just a second ago, was one of our negative leverage players in our research build. You can see how is SaberSim dealing with this for our first 20 lineups? Well, it's saying match the field essentially completely evenly, right? Tyreek Hill, match the field very close to evenly. How are we dealing with Eli Mitchell, another player that was showing up as a negative leverage play in our research build, right? We're half the field, or about a third of the field, right? In this case. So if you've ever wondered why is SaberSim taking these particular stands on particular players, I think the research build can be a helpful way of learning that, right? Like if you looked at this and you're like, why is Sony Michel popping so much, right? Holy crap, what's going on here? I actually think the research build is an interesting way of solving that question for you, right? We have a situation where at least at the moment, with the way the slate is projected right now, he is our fifth best overall leverage play on the slate, where two of the positions above him are defenses and kind of don't really matter as much anyway. So that would at least explain that. And you can come back here now and maybe, tone down maybe your exposure to Sony Michel a little bit. And obviously things will change a lot as the slate goes on. But I'm going to kind of wrap this question up because I could talk about research builds for literally like an hour. And I'll kind of summarize this into a couple or a few different points that I think research builds can be especially used for. So first of all, I like to use these builds on high variance sports where there isn't likely to be a ton of news that changes the slate completely after the point when you run these builds, right? I think they are useful in comparing the chance of a player being optimal to the ownership projection to determine maybe some plays that I want to be over the field on or under the field on relative to the field, right? Based on what I see here, right? I think probably the most interesting player that popped to me just right off the bat is Clyde Edwards-Helaire, right? A running back in a better position to get probably more reliable stats or snaps than Sony Michel, has a little bit of a higher raw chance of being in the optimal than Michel, and you still get a lot of leverage relative to the field. I think that's an interesting play. I think you can also come up with some plays maybe to fade, right? Or at least it gives you an idea of what the builder might like by default, right? Some of the players that are likely maybe to be a little bit more faded, at least where where the projections are right now are Mitchell, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Juwan Jennings, etc. And we saw that in our test build here. So that's how I use it for. And that's what I'm looking. That's basically what I'm mostly looking for. And there's more there. Sometimes I'll start to pull in correlations a little bit and look, if I'm going to take a significant stand on Eli Mitchell, right? For example, maybe I've decided I want to make a heavy stand. I might go in and look and see who's he negatively correlated with and maybe get, here's an interesting name, Michelle again, Akers, right? Get more exposure to some of the players that he's negatively correlated with. But that is kind of, I think, like my basic version of what I'm doing with these particular builds. So if you actually go in and run a research build for this weekend slate for this week of NFL, definitely go in and remove that player filter before you do that, because I think the fact that the Bengals defense is technically not in the pool. In fact, I would actually probably just remove that player filter completely, or maybe set it to 0, because I would say you almost certainly want to have the Bengals defense in your player pool for this week. I think it's actually that's even projected as low as they are. You at least probably want them in your pool. But anyway, that was the one thing I would look at there. So, I guess the last note I will mention here on the research builds, the last thing that I think can be useful is I think it can actually be a little bit of a tool to use to study the ownership projections themselves or check on the ownership projections, right? Because we're not saying here that Eli Mitchell is the best fade on the slate, right? We are saying that if he is owned 49.2% of the time, that he has the biggest difference between his percent chance of being in the optimal and his ownership projection on the slate, right? But sometimes the answer to that is not, I'm going to go in and be under the field on Eli Mitchell. It's actually maybe this ownership projection is off. And there isn't really a player that is like really jumping out to me at the moment. I actually would say this. I would say this is probably the number that seems low to me, right? So we could say at the current projections as we have it, if Clyde Edwards-Helaire is only 6% owned, he's the best non-defense leverage play on the slate at the moment, right? But this actually seems low to me. And this is the number I would actually push back against. So sometimes the answer in terms of and I think I talked about this in my original NFL video, sometimes the answer of what I do with the research build information is not just immediately jump to go make sure I have a ton of exposure to that player or go and fade that player. It's actually to make an adjustment to the ownership projections, right? So I think this can be another tool for if you're looking at ownership projections and have a sense that some of them might be off, but you're not really sure where. I think this can be a tool of learning that for yourself, right? Typically, if you go in here and run a research build and there's a massive discrepancy between how often the player is showing up in their exposure versus what their ownership projection is, something has to be wrong. Either the field is very off on a player and that's an edge, or the ownership projections are very off on a player and that's something that should be fixed or updated. So, but anyway, I got to cut myself off on the research build questions because I will legitimately talk about it for a long time. I think it's one of the more interesting things that I've discovered that you can do with SaberSim. So I am going to move us along here from now. So anyway, someone give me a wave or something. I've been talking here for like 35 minutes. It seems pretty quiet in chat today. Let me know that you guys are still out there, that I'm not talking everybody to sleep here. Give me a sign. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and keep answering questions that came in before the start of the stream, and hope that not everybody's asleep here listening to me wax about research builds for like 20 minutes. Dan's here. All right, cool. So I haven't managed to lose everybody. All right, cool. So another question here. How early should you load lineups into FanDuel or DK with the CSV file prior to the contest start time? Should it be 1 hour prior, leaving you enough time to late swap, versus a half hour prior and late swapping the last 15 minutes prior to contest start time? Okay, so a couple questions here, a couple things to touch on. First of all, because of how easy the entry editor makes it to get lineups into your contest, I'm going to be a little bit hypocritical here. You really should never leave dummies in your contests anymore. Like, it doesn't make sense. There's no reason to do it. Dummies I'm referring to as just a random lineup that you typed in quickly and put into all your entries. Or if you reserve entries like I do, don't leave those in there anymore because it's not worth it, right? It's far too easy to get lineups into your contests here, right? And I'll actually even just do it now. Let's change this here. So let's get the fresh entries file here, and let's put some real lineups in. So really what I would recommend is as soon as you've reserved or entered your dummy lineups for the slate that night, just go in here and hang on. I need to delete these builds. Okay, there we go. Just go in here and put some real lineups in because it's so easy, right? So you should do this, I would say, whoops. As soon as you can, as soon as you think about it. I mean, the worst case scenario is that something happens, something comes up, you're not going to be around for lock, your internet goes out, and it's nice to know that you've at least got playable lineups in there. You don't have one copy of the same dummy lineup you put in every contest. So you should do that as soon as possible. Right. So in terms of then, approaching lock, what are we doing approaching lock here? For NBA, right? Well, I guess let me put it this way. For any sport, you should wait to build. You should build your final lineups when you have all the information you need, at least about the games that are starting when lock happens, right? So NBA, typically, I'm putting in my final lineups, like honestly, sometimes 5, 10, 15 minutes at most before the first round of games is set to start. It's basically whenever all these starting lineups come out, right? That's when my final lineups are going in. Now, I do think it is a good idea. Let's say it's a little bit before 1 o'clock here Mountain Time, right? So the slate starts at 5 p.m. Mountain Time. Typically, I think it's a good idea, especially if I'm around, I'm studying the slate, I'm watching news come in. I will kind of do one update to my lineups about an hour before lock, which is kind of, again, just improving upon the entries that are already in there, right? I'm like, I know I'm going to update this again one more time when the news comes out, but if I'm waiting to the last second to get a lineup and then the internet goes out or something happens or there's some reason I need to step away, I can improve upon my lineups by making sure that everything was built with the information we had 1 hour before lock, then whatever was up there at noon. So a lot of times I'll make an update at noon. But most of the time for NBA, I'm doing my final build, my final run of lineups that are actually going to go in somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes before lock. With that said, I do think this question has kind of maybe a mistake in here. So this question says, leaving you enough time to late swap versus a half hour prior and late swapping the last 15 minutes prior to the contest start time. I would never actually use the late swap tool to rebuild lineups before the contest locks, unless you are in an extreme pinch and need to update everything very quickly. But assuming that you have at least 5 minutes or so to update, I think you're always better off starting with a fresh build, because what that's going to do is it's going to mean that you get a full pool of lineups. We give the builder an opportunity to identify the best 20 out of them. I think in general, you're going to end up with a little bit of higher quality lineups for lock if you run a brand new build rather than late swapping lineups that already exist. So unless you're in a pinch and you really need to do everything like really quick, I would just start with a fresh build instead of doing a late swap. But all of that said, most of the time I will update everything 5 or 15 minutes before lock. So, but Chris said, drink some water, man. Good job. Yeah, you're right. Honestly, yesterday my throat started drying up on me midstream here. I probably should do a little bit of a better job. Grabbing a sip of water here in the middle of the stream. It looks like I woke everybody up here. HC said we're here. It's so funny this says elbow cough. I realize now that that's the dab emoji, or maybe it's the elbow cough emoji. But Dan said, don't forget to smash that like button, y'all. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially today. Smash the like button for the research build question, because I love my research builds on here. So, okay, cool. Let's take a moment, reset, catch our breaths here. We have a handful of other questions here. 3 questions in Slack. I see a couple that came in YouTube chat. We're going to keep ripping through these here. We won't be able to go a full 2 hours again here today. I'll probably stop around 3:30 Eastern, 1:30 my time if we make it that far. But we'll keep it going for now here. A question from Gootsman04. And he said, when building lineups, let's say you want 300 and your pool is 500. So let's say you have a core of 4 players that you want at least 60% of. So when I'm going to fill my lines, my contest with lines, is there a quick and easy way to get 60% for that core or not? Okay, a couple things. First of all, if you're playing 300 unique lineups, don't build a pool of 500. That's too small. That's not going to be enough. I would say if you have 300 unique lineups, right? And I know this is the default, right? I'm aware of the fact that this is the default. So this isn't anything that you did wrong. This is on our end. I've had a note for us to fix this for a while, and we just need to do it, frankly. Anytime you are playing over, I would say 100 lineups, your pool size should probably jump up to 1,500, right? So first of all, definitely do that. When your pool is at 500 and you're playing 300 out of that, you're not even giving yourself 2 lineups per lineup that you're actually going to play to make adjustments. So you're going to end up with a really rigid, unflexible pool here that doesn't let you do anything. So I would do that first. Second, if you know for a fact that you have a core of players that you want 60% of each, just set that before you build. And then we'll make sure you have that, right? If you know that you want 60% Jokic, let's just like build a little core here, right? We want 60% Jokic. Let's pick a couple value plays. 60%. I don't know. Who's somebody that maybe one of these plays is a little bit lower owned. Cody Martin, if maybe that ownership is going to be a little bit right. Let's say, just for fun, we want 60% Harden. We're going to put a little pressure on the builder here because of these salaries, but let's say this is our core, right? And Terrence Mann. So this is our core, right? We want 60% of each of these guys. We're playing 300 lineups. We're going to go in here. We're going to set this beforehand so that the builder knows that we want it. And now we should be able to just build this here, and it should match all the exposures for the players. So if you know this information beforehand, if you know how you want to tackle the slate, just put it in before in step 1. And I know sometimes on stream I've come on here and talked about the value of doing things in step 3 versus step 1, the advantages, the pros and cons between the two. Really, ultimately, any information that you know before you build the lineups that you want to see in step 3, just put it in step 1 or 2 so that your pool is more representative of what you're actually trying to work with here. But now what we're going to see here is for our 300 unique lineups we're playing, we're going to have a pool of 1,500 behind them. Each lineup from our set of 300 is basically going to have 5 different ones to choose between. And now we'll have a little bit more flexibility to make adjustments here on step 3. So, yeah, Dan, I just happened to answer your question here. Is it better to set before or after? Again, this is something I've talked about quite a bit in different streams here. It depends on what you're trying to do, but in general, if you know that you want to approach a slate a certain way, you should set it beforehand, not after. Because then your pool that you're working with here in step 3 is better going to represent what you're trying to do. If you're a little bit more open-minded, if you're a little bit more neutral about the way you want to tackle the slate, I think it's better to make adjustments in step 3, because then you're working from more of kind of a purer form of lineups that is more like untouched, right? Like we in the inputs to this system for this particular build, we left an impact, right? We told the builder, give us 60% of each of these 4 players. So then we got a ton of these players. So while we have a better set of 1,500 lineups for us to work with that represent the way that we want to tackle this slate, this is not like an untouched version of the lineups that SaberSim was producing. So if you wanted to just see the way SaberSim was attacking the slate by default and make your own subtle adjustments from there, then in that case, you would want to make adjustments on step 3. So I know kind of a little tricky there. In general, like basic fundamentals, big changes in step 1, fine-tuning and quality controlling in step 3 is the way to think about it. So, but anyway, Gootsman, I think that probably helps answer the question here. You can see all good. We got our nice core. You'll see players that are projected very highly that the builder already wanted to use. You're probably going to get more than your minimum anyway. But in this case, Jokic only projected 4.5 points per dollar on tonight's slate. There are other pay-up options that the builder likes more at the moment. You see we're actually a little bit closer to that 60%, but we could come in here and make adjustments from here. We could say, maybe that's a little bit too much Terrence Mann, and maybe bring him down to like 80. Just like that. So all good. All good. All right. 12 pack has a question here. And he said, given the advantage in NBA late swapping, would it make sense to build initial lineups slanted more to the later games so that lineups have more room for late swap opportunities? In a general sense, some lineups that may not be practical, or some nights that may not be practical. Yes, absolutely. I think that's pretty sharp overall. I think let's go look at tonight's slate. So I would not take random shots in the dark with this. Would be my main thing that I would say here. Right, random shots in the dark, meaning if there are no truly questionable players playing in the late games, don't just pump up the projections or the exposure to one of these teams on the off chance that someone gets randomly scratched. But if there is a player playing somewhere in these late games, right? Let's see. Is there anybody questionable on any of these later teams playing? Okay, here's an interesting one. Memphis is kind of interesting tonight. Brandon Clark, Desmond Bane, questionable. Players that, should they get ruled out, are likely to open up value on other parts of Memphis. One of my favorite ways to do this is to just give everybody a little bit of a gentle nudge here, right? Doesn't need to be a ton. Maybe even just like two ticks here, right? Let's show to SaberSim that we want to emphasize this game, right? Let's get these guys in here. And then when we go in and build, we're going to be a little bit more overweight to using players from this game. Now, if Bane doesn't get ruled out, if Clark doesn't get ruled out, we're fine. We swap off of them later, right? Sometimes there's even an advantage. You'll see I upped Bane's projection too. Sometimes there's a little bit of an advantage because if Bane doesn't get ruled out, right, you probably get him at an ownership discount because people were afraid of the questionable tag. So I think this is a good idea. I think it's pretty sharp. I would say you really only want to do this when there's an actual legitimate questionable threat. So like it probably wouldn't even be enough for me to just be like, oh, Bane questionable, I do this. I would probably want to go research this. And like maybe we can go look at Basketball Monster, and I would probably want to go see like, why is this guy questionable? Is he legitimately questionable? Does he actually have a chance of sitting? So it looks like this is a health protocols thing. So might be something we get news to sooner rather than later. We'll see, but something to pay attention to, right? Sometimes you'll see too, there might be a player listed as questionable on SaberSim that's actually more closer to probable elsewhere. That's another thing to look for. The one other situation I'll add to this is that I really like doing this on slates where there is no value, right? I'll say one thing at a time. I like doing this on a slate. I like doing this a lot on slates where there is very limited value because other players, the value that would open up if a player got ruled out is not there when you're looking at the raw projections at lock. And on a slate where there's no value, everybody else is going to pack all their lineups full of all these random average players and miss out on the opportunity to build a better lineup with the value plays in it later. So I like to do it for those slates a lot. The one other slate type that I'll think about doing this, and I think you can get a big edge, is actually kind of like last night, but we didn't get the corresponding other side of it. We did a little bit. So last night we had a ton of value, right? But it was all in the early games, right? So on a slate where there is early games with value available, right? And there is significant pending news in a late game, like not minor news. I don't even know if the Bane news is enough, but I'm talking like, let's say a legitimate situation where like Luka is legitimately questionable, like a true 50-50 playing in the late game. And we have a bunch of value in the early game. Everybody's just going to play the safe value in the early game, right? No one's going to actually think about like, what is Brunson's projection? What is DFS's projection? What are all these guys' projections going to become for the Mavs if Luka gets ruled out? Because they've got the value, right? On a slate with no value, I think people are a little bit more aware of like, here's where value could open up. But on a slate that already has existing value, everybody's just going to play that. I think on this kind of particular slate, if you had that, right, you could justify doing this because at that point, what you're saying is that equivalent value may open up later at a fraction of the ownership. And if the late value outperforms the early value just by a little bit, you get a huge edge on the field. So we got it. Back to my point about yesterday, we did get it a little bit. It just wasn't as impactful. The pending news wasn't as impactful as I would have liked. But yesterday, Patrick Beverley, who plays a legitimate role in the Wolves rotation, was questionable going into lock. And we had all of this exposure to early value in yesterday's slate. I bumped up my Pat Bev and Wolves projections just a little bit because I liked that edge there a little. And when it came time to swap, Pat Bev gets ruled out halfway through the slate. I actually ended up finding a way to swap into a lot of Anthony Edwards last night, which didn't give me some crazy ceiling outcome. I didn't bank anything, but I did have a much better night than I expected, and I liked that edge quite a bit as the night went on, right? The other problem, too, is all the value in the early games went off, right? But if they had slightly underperformed expectation, I think there probably would have been a little bit of an edge there. So I do think that can be a pretty cool strategy here. I think that can be a pretty sharp strategy of intentionally weighting your lineups to get an edge with late swap news. But again, if there's no pending news, don't count on a random scratch, right? There needs to be some kind of news, right? From there, I think that my favorite way personally to go about getting those players in your lineup is to just bump their projections. And in particular, I like this a lot on slates where there's otherwise no real value available or where all the value is condensed in the early games. So anyway, let's keep it going. John's right. Smash that like button. I love saying that. I don't know why. It's fun to say. All right. Last question from GEN. Then we'll hit the questions in YouTube chat real quickly. This question says, do you normally go with the optimizer, what the optimizer gives you for players, or are you moving X amount of players before you enter your lineups into contests? I don't do a lot with like player pool curation kind of things, at least for most sports. Personally, I don't like that approach as much. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Again, this question's written for me, so I'm going to answer it for me. I prefer to do more of my process in step 3 by adjusting things, adjusting exposures, adjusting which players go into my lineups in step 3 more, just because I like the idea, with some exceptions, right? But I like the idea of kind of having a more pure pool of lineups that has not been like tampered with my adjustments. I like having that for my full pool of 1,500 and then selecting 4 lineups in there. So that's just my approach. But I don't think there's anything wrong with a heavier approach on player pool curation in step 1 or heavier edits. Like if you've watched Max's video about his process, right? This video here, how to beat daily fantasy basketball like an NBA DFS pro. You'll see he spends like a ton of his time in step 1, adjusting his player pool, tweaking with player projections. And then when he hits build, he almost more like generally just kind of takes exactly what the builder gives out to him. It's like a different approach. His work is put in ahead of time, presses build, takes the lineups kind of as they are coming out. My approach is a little bit more leave things alone in step 1, press build, make adjustments in step 3, and then take those and push them out. In NBA in particular, a lot of times I'm not even really making a lot of adjustments on either step, and I'm just hoping and counting and fingers crossed that there's big late swap news that 75% of the field is going to ignore. But for other sports where I do a little bit more work ahead of time, NFL, MLB, I will typically make more adjustments in step 3 than step 1. So 12 pack about the late swap thing. Any thoughts on boosting a late game versus reducing an early game? I don't like to go the route of reducing an early game as much because I still like, I want to get exposure to those plays if they're good plays. I also think like typically it is one particular game where the late swap opportunity exists. So rather than going in and making an adjustment to all of the other games or even a subset of the other games, I would prefer to just bump the game in question, right? Like if it is truly, and again, tonight is maybe even not the best example of this, but if the edge is if Bane and Clark get ruled out, then bump the Grizzlies. That's just the way it makes sense to me, because that's the team that's going to benefit if those guys get ruled out. So, HC said, Jordan, do you think playing one lineup and having the default at 500 is too much for playing one lineup? No, I think it's fine. It's not going to make anything worse, and it doesn't take much more to build 500 lineups than it takes to build 100. So I think there's a big advantage to increasing your pool size once you're playing more than 100-ish lineups from 500 to 1,500, but I don't think there's any advantage to dropping your pool size from 500 to 100 unless you're like totally out of time and need a build to go super quick. So, okay, let's catch up here. I think I did a pretty good job of keeping track of chat here today. Craig said, in terms of late swap, will it always make a change? Let's say SaberSim determines that 3 out of the lineups are already the best they can be. Will it just swap the other 17 lineups, leaving the best 3 unchanged? You can have a lineup that doesn't change at all after late swapping, but the higher your sim variance slider is, the more likely your lineups are to change no matter what, right? For example, I think it's easiest seen at the extremes. So if your sim variance is 0, right? There's no variance on a per lineup basis. We're using the average projections for every single lineup. So in this particular case, lineups are likely to stay exactly the same unless the projections changed, because we're just using the average projection to build each lineup. But if your sim variance was 10, right? Let's say in your original build, you had a random set of 1 simulation for all 10 games on the slate, and that formed a lineup. Well, when you late swap it, we grab a different random set of 10 game simulations. So your lineup is actually probably likely to change significantly, even if no news has changed. Like maybe in your we're talking about just one lineup here. Maybe the first time you built it, the Kings and Hawks went to double overtime in that sim. Well, you had a 4-3 Kings and Hawks game stack. And it was the second. And then when you late swap that lineup, maybe you get a situation where that game goes 10 points under its implied total. So your lineup ends up totally different. And the average projections haven't changed at all. You are just selecting a different set of sims. So your lineups are likely to change, I would say, with regular general default sliders, at least somewhat, even if the projections haven't changed. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? In fact, it's probably a neutral thing. We're just selecting sims differently, but it's not like if you're used to the Roto Grinders optimizer or the Labs optimizer or Fantasy Cruncher, and you traditionally built on those optimizers with 0 randomness, what you would typically see is that a lot of your lineups would not change at all, right? You would late swap. Some of your lineups would not change. The only ones that would change would be that if there was a lineup or there was a way to get a higher average projection in the lineup. That's not really the case here in this case, because every time you late swap, we're going to kind of reselect simulations for the remaining parts of the lineup. So something to note there. But yeah. Angel says, what's your best advice for showdowns on NBA? I have actually an hour-long video on it. It's right here. It's on our SaberSim YouTube channel. In our NBA course, you don't have to be a pro to beat NBA showdowns. I'd go watch this. I'm happy to answer any kind of follow-up questions you have, talk about this more. But this hour-long video is full of way more detail than I can go here on stream. So I'd start here, watch this, and then come back and let me know if you have any thoughts. But I have really been enjoying NBA showdowns this year. I went to the Nuggets and Timberwolves game in like December and just set a couple lineups just to mess around. I hadn't played NBA Showdown all year. I set a couple lineups just to have a sweat in the game. I was drinking beer, doing my like same game parlays too on DraftKings, whatever. But I took that contest down that night, which again is not representative of a healthy process. It was probably mostly just pure luck. But I took it down and I was like, maybe I should give these a second look. And then since then, I've been playing NBA Showdown basically every single night. It is also a little bit refreshing knowing you don't have to late swap. Dan says that's totally awesome, Jordan. Thank you. It is totally awesome. It felt totally awesome taking it down in the stands at the game. So, but anyway, yeah, I have a whole video up on NBA Showdowns. I'd watch that first. I think with SaberSim in particular, because we have game simulations for the game, right? We're writing out game scripts for how these games can play, just like football, just like other sports. I think we are poised to crush Showdown. So. Adam says, personally, I prefer tweaking builds in step 3, but it's worth getting used to all the tools at your disposal in all facets. That is, if I'm pressed for time before lock and want lots of a player who typically wouldn't come up, I may use exposure settings to get it done ASAP. Yeah, I think everybody has a little bit, ultimately when you get familiar with SaberSim, you'll build a process that kind of ends up being a little bit unique to you. Like you'll use different combinations of player, or I don't know what I'm talking about. It's not what I meant to say. You'll use different combinations of the tools at your disposal to get what you want that may lead to a similarly profitable lineup to somebody that's doing something completely different. I've watched what Max does, and I have an immense amount of respect for the way that he builds his lineups, and there's no way that I could ever really do it that way. Like going in and making adjustments to projections on a kind of team by team or game by game basis. And it just doesn't, it has never made sense to me the way I kind of think about playing DFS, but I think it's awesome. And it's just different than the way I do it. Right. So to each their own, but I do think broadly speaking, if you are going to make significant changes to what the builder is giving you, you are better off, or if you know things you want to see in your builds in step 3, you are better off probably doing some of that in step 1, just so that pool of lineups looks the way you want it to. But Chris says, what's your go-to NBA courtside beer? That's a good question. I grew up here in Colorado, so I don't know if I'm going to ruffle some feathers with this here, but the go-to is probably Coors for me. Now, it's a big craft beer scene out here too, so I will get down on the craft beer. I'll get the craft IPA sometimes. We have some Odell's and New Belgium and things like that out here, which are awesome too. But like the go-to, I don't have busy line. You've been standing in line for 15 minutes. Don't have time to stare down the list of taps. It's always going to be Coors for me. Joseph says, for NBA, thoughts on doing a research build, finding the top percent exposure players, and then bumping the projection of those players and rebuild using the defaults. Okay, good question. I think if you are going to do a research build, this is probably the best way to do this in NBA, because if you don't adjust projections, if you instead choose to handle what you learned from your research build in step 3 with exposures, I think you are asking for trouble when you get to late swapping, because when new news breaks, you have to kind of rethink about, do you want to change the exposures, right? With projections, if you've bumped projections maybe in the Denver-Brooklyn game because you think there's leverage there, for example, in game, and then you are late swapping later, you don't have to decide, do I need to rethink the projections of players in this game so much? The builder can kind of decide, does it need to, like, is the new value still as good as the players you've changed their projections in at 6 p.m. here? So I think this is a really good approach. I would say the one thing to be cautious of is that, like, in theory, as the slate goes on, if news breaks that you would late swap to, I would say it is theoretically sharpest to rebuild that research build with default projections and see how things have changed and see if you still want to make adjustments. But this is kind of where you get into trouble, because then in reality, like, that new research build that you're running is going to assume that the slate hasn't started yet. It's going to assume that players aren't locked into lineups yet. It's going to assume that all the players are still available in the pool. So you can kind of get into trouble here a little bit. But I would say if you like the idea of running this research build, if it resonates with you, if you find it's kind of a good way to find some maybe lower owned plays, I think the best way to use it in your process is via adjusting projections, because it will be a little more anti-fragile to adjust to changes in the slate later. Exposures are going to be very fragile. You may set a minimum exposure to a certain player at lock based on your research build, and even though other value has opened up later, the lineup builder is still kind of stuck holding on to that minimum exposure because you set it. When it's a projection, the builder can determine how much exposure is worth putting to that player compared to all the other players in the slate. So, good question. I like, yes, broadly speaking, I think this is a good strategy. I think this makes a lot of sense, but to just be cautious for the same reason I tell people to exercise caution with research builds in general for NBA, is because things change quickly. So, but yeah, good stuff. Let me know if that helps. Craig says, a couple questions ago, when you individually bumped all the Grizzlies players, could you just bump the Grizzlies team school by 5 or 10 points? Would that essentially be the same thing? Yeah, that essentially would have the same impact. It's probably a little bit faster. I just don't have the muscle memory for doing this as much. But because I'm more used to just adjusting things on a per player basis. But I guess the one thing to look out for is that this affects the entire game. So this may have an unintended consequence on the Spurs players. Like, they're not going to move a ton. You can see these are like very, very small changes, but it does impact because the Grizzlies are not going out and playing basketball against no one. They're playing the Spurs. So changing their team total actually changes it updates projections based on a limited selection of simulations for this game, which does impact the Spurs. So. Steven says, what should my sliders be for the piggy bank on FanDuel? We have made it easy for you. I would go in here and I would just put in the contest settings and lock and load with what we tell you. So piggy bank is a GPP. It is a 150 max, and there are almost always more than 50,000 people in it, 50,000 lineups. So I would use these. These sliders have been back tested for other contests of a similar style, entry limit, and entrance on FanDuel. And we feel pretty confident in them in terms of building successful lineups. So that's what I would use. Adam says, are you using the no more than 1% of entries heuristic for NBA Showdowns? Or you just limit this even more? It seems tough to figure out the number of profitable / non-duped lineups for NBA Showdown slates. I still use this. I use it basically to a T, actually. So DraftKings does pretty similar. DraftKings has pretty consistent contest sizing. Like, they don't just randomly size their contests. So I've been playing NBA Showdown for virtually every single NBA game that there is, at least on the nights that I'm playing, and sizing accordingly to the contest. So there are contests that are, if there's a contest that's, well, I'm mostly only playing 20 max. I haven't been playing very many 150 max. I don't know if there are 150 maxes for Showdown, but I've been sticking to 20 maxes. But there are plenty that are over 2,000 entrants. In those cases, I just max them out. There seems to be kind of a lot of contests sized at like 1,800 entrants. In those, I'll play 18. There are some that are 1,400. I'll play 14. And some that are 1,200. I'll play 12, etc. So, and I feel like that works pretty good. I like how that feels in terms of my investment to the contest versus what I stand to gain if I win. I like how that feels. So 1% of the total lineups in the contest maximum for me. But all right. I think we just about covered it there. Don't see any other questions here coming in. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. Another fun stream today. Thanks everybody for coming in, hanging out with me here. We'll be right back at it again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. I will tell you what, I am all messed up since the golf tournament started today. I keep thinking tomorrow's Friday, but tomorrow is indeed Thursday. So we'll be right back again tomorrow. Oh, let's get one more here. Let's get one more. Joseph, we'll get your question before we leave. Going back to the research build, does it make sense to just bump players in the early games only? Maybe. The problem is that you, at the end of the day, you're still building lineups at lock that include players from all the games. So if you only made adjustments to those early games, you might, an unintended consequence of that might be losing your ability to swap. So here's what I think. Here's what I think ultimately makes sense. I would say do your research build. Assemble your takeaways from that build. Figure out what the players you want to be under on and what the players you want to be over on are. Make your adjustments to those players on a per projection level, but be prepared to adjust as needed as the slate goes on. And I think, so for example, like make your adjustments to all the teams, right? If the leverage is in the early games, then bump the early games. If the leverage is in the later games, bump those games. But as the slate goes on, you obviously don't need to make any changes to games that have already started. So as the slate goes on, right? Like let's say we get to 5:30 and now we're really just looking at this set of games, right? If news breaks at this point, what you really need to do is you need to determine if your updates to player projections in one direction or the other are still valid, right? Is a team that you bumped their projections down because you thought they were going to be over-owned, is that still a bad play if their best player got ruled out and now all the players are projected better? Or vice versa, is a team that is projected decently but you thought was going to be under-owned still worth bumping up now that insane value has opened up elsewhere, right? Those are the decisions you need to make as the slate goes on. And that's where I think this can be a little bit challenging. I would say if you get, let me think about this. This is a tough problem to solve, and this is why I don't do research builds as much for NBA, because I think this is hard. Like, it's really challenging to know exactly what to do. I think you have a couple options at your disposal. If significant news breaks, that feels like it kind of changes the slate. I think one thing you can do is just clear out your custom projections and just late swap and basically say, I got the edge that I got at lock by working with the information I had at the time and making adjustments to projections. And there is enough of an edge of simply late swapping to what are now the best plays playing in the later games that I don't need to worry about the research build. And that's actually, I think, an interesting idea. And that way you're almost hedging against a slate where no late swap opportunities show up. Like, you're basically creating a situation where you're saying either no late swap opportunities show up and my research build is valid throughout basically the entirety of the slate. I'm not even talking about, like, minor late swap opportunities are one thing. I'm talking about significant late swap opportunities. So, like, either my research build stays mostly valid all slate and I get an edge from doing this ownership analysis of the best plays on the slate, or a huge late swap opportunity opens up and I clear out those custom projections and I get an edge by swapping to this big news that a lot of the field doesn't swap. That, I think, is an interesting idea. And that way your research build almost becomes a hedge about not getting an edge elsewhere, which I think is interesting. That's actually an interesting idea. I've actually, that is coming to me kind of organically right now. I've never thought about doing it that way. I was going to say the other alternative option, I think there's kind of a spectrum of alternative options. I would say the other option is big news breaks. And maybe what you do is just clear out your custom projections for that particular team, right? Like, maybe, again, the slate's going on and you had earlier in the day thought that, the Nets were going to be over-owned, right? Maybe especially like Harden or something like that. And then throughout the slate, like, news breaks in this game, something changes, you're under on Harden. Maybe you just clear out your Nets projections and just say, whatever, I'm going to rock with what I have in there. I think the third and most extreme option is when news breaks in the slate to rerun a fresh research build and readjust projections for each team based on what the new research build says to do. And I think that's the most time-intensive way to do it. But I think that's kind of like the third way I would approach this. So all of this to say, research builds in NBA, there's a lot of complexity because the research we do at lock isn't necessarily valid at 30 minutes after or an hour after or 2 hours after. So there's going to be complexity here either way. Honestly, I think my favorite idea I have had surrounding research builds in NBA just came now organically on the stream, and that is using it as kind of that hedge against the late swap opportunity. I think that's actually a really cool idea. So again, the idea here is, like, you use your research build as long as it is valid. And as soon as you've decided it doesn't work anymore because the information is out of date, you just swap. You just reset everything and then swap with the late swap news that you now have. I think that's great. And I think that's pretty creative. Because you're getting an edge either way. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting idea. Let me know what you think of that. If that answered your question here. In the meantime, I am going to go ahead. We'll call the stream here today. So we will be right back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Good luck in your contests here tonight. If you have questions, setting lineups, going through anything, late swapping, whatever, throughout the slate tonight, as always, feel free to email us, support@sabersim.com, or drop a question in the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we'll get to it tomorrow. In the meantime, see ya.